Hi, it's Colin Rowe again. Last time I was talking about keeping the rules, and this time I'd like to keep on about keeping the rules. Now, one big hole in my trawl through the Bible and ancient history in support of my argument about the rules being essential to society, etc., was I completely left out the writings of Paul. Now, he's got quite a lot to say about rules, and they're quite complicated things to understand. I'll start off with a story from my own experience. I remember in the later years of the last Labour government, the Blair government, that is, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was saying, well, people are breaking the law without thinking about it, without thinking twice about the rule of law or anything. So I said, well, do you realise that in the past years since Tony Blair became Prime Minister, 3,000 new offences have been invented, as it were. They've been put on the statute book. So that's 3,000 more occasions on which people can break the law, apart from all the other occasions when they could break the law before. So it seemed to me a bit unfair, really, to put the great British public at such a huge disadvantage that they could barely set foot in front of each other without breaking some kind of new law that the government had invented. Well, strangely enough, St. Paul makes a similar sort of point. In Romans, he has a lot to say about the law. Well, he obviously means the Jewish law, but we're talking about law in general. But he makes an interesting observation in chapter 7 of his letter to the Romans. He says, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. Indeed, I would not have known what sin was, except through the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was, if the law had not said, 'Do not covet.'" And he goes on to illustrate this conundrum that once you have law, once you have rules, then you discover you're not very good at keeping them. You break them all over the place. Well, this was especially true of the Jewish ceremonial and ritual law, because there were just so many of them, and presumably there still are. Not being a Jew, I'm not totally au fait with every single one of them. It would probably take me a lifetime to try and figure out what all of them are. But Paul said, when the law revived, I died. This is a really graphic way of saying, well, you got me banged to rights, Gov. I'm as guilty as charged. I've broken this and I've broken that law, and I've got nothing to say about it, really. I'm just condemned where I stand. So here we are in this fix that there are so many rules, there are so many laws, we really can't help but break a few of them now and again. Now, I said last time that there was a law which I thought kind of made things a lot simpler for us condemned sinners, if you like to put it that way, and that is living according to the law of love, where, I remind you, Jesus said, the two most important commandments are that you should love God and you should love your neighbour. And this is a guideline. This is a universal guideline to the good life. So now there's another piece that I want to have a look at in the letter to the Galatians. Paul again having a say about how life should be lived. And he's talking about two laws here. It's interesting because there's a law according to the flesh, as he says, and then there's a law according to the Spirit. So you remember I was talking about the law being engraved on men's hearts, that the prophets found that all this law stuff was not working. People were giving up in despair about being unable to keep the law in any meaningful way, and they were just stopping, they were just not bothering, and their disregard of the laws of God were, it seemed, getting the nation into all kinds of trouble, because lawlessness is something that deeply troubles a nation. And we're seeing this in America now, for instance. A piece of video, of graphic video, showed a policeman in Minneapolis leaning on a black man, and the black man subsequently died. And this was for all to see. It's posted on social media, and it was spread all over the world so that it could be seen what the police were doing was an obvious crime and needed to be dealt with, but it wasn't dealt with. And people were getting very angry. And there are news reports this weekend about so many people out in the streets protesting about this terrible crime that remained unacknowledged even by the authorities. As it is, the policeman concerned has been arrested, and people are still not happy because it's an ongoing problem. So there's lawlessness, not just on the part of a population, but also on the part of the people who are supposed to be passing the laws and policing them. Still, here's Paul in Galatians, and he comes up with what I consider to be a sort of recipe for the good life. There's lots of other stuff that he said around this subject. But the only thing I want to pick out are these little lists. In the letter to the Galatians, chapter 5, in verse 19, if anyone wants to look it up, there's this first list, the acts of the sinful nature. This is what in the old King James Version are called the sins of the flesh, the works of the flesh, he says. It makes a good sound for a sermon, doesn't it? The works of the flesh. Anyway, he's got an alarming list of the works of the flesh, or the acts of the sinful nature. He says they're obvious, and when you hear this list, they are pretty obvious. So, sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, my goodness, heavy stuff. Idolatry and witchcraft. Now we come to part of the list that maybe we can relate a bit more obviously to in our 21st century world. Hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, oh dear, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, oh that's interesting, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like, he says. So the list is not all inclusive. There's quite a bit about sex in that list, isn't there? You seem to have a thing about sex, did St. Paul? So these are called the acts of the sinful nature, or the works of the flesh. Now, this is one part of the recipe, okay? This is the not to do list. This is the leave it out. We don't want to know about this kind of stuff list. These are the things to eliminate from your life. They're undesirable and they have bad effects. And we remember, I said last week, the effect of living life according to the law of love has a knock-on effect in yourself and in others around you. And these are beneficial, these are good effects. They're knock-on effects that really help you to live a healthy life and promote a healthy society as well. So the other part, the positive part of the recipe for living life according to the law of love, is a little bit further on, but what he calls the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And he goes on to hammer the point home that these are good things by saying, against such things there is no law. So the person who meditates on and practices and promotes around him, around her, all these qualities is not ever likely to break any kind of a law. That's an interesting statement, isn't it? And I think it's as true today as it was when Paul wrote these words, which is interesting because that was about 2,000 years ago. People do make the point that, the Bible's a hoary old book and it's got all sorts of bits and pieces that seem to be not very relevant to our day and age. But actually, I think this is quite relevant. So who can argue against living a life of love and joy and peace? How do you get there? In the old days, and maybe even now, there were Christians who said, who use words like sanctification, heavy old word, sanctification. My goodness, it means holiness, growing holiness in your life. But they never, I didn't find that they explained to me clearly what this holiness was all about. So I was kind of left in the dark. It was some kind of mysterious quality that you sort of gained by, by thinking good thoughts or something. I'm not quite sure. They pointed to this entity called the Holy Spirit. And that's a good place to start, because the Holy Spirit is the God nature implanted in human beings. And it's a good start to trying to turn your life around, maybe from the other stuff like practicing hatred and discord and jealousy and fits of rage and selfish ambition, dissensions, envy, etc., let alone all the other rather more juicy items in that list. So you can kind of draw a line under that. You can say, right, this is the list that I must weed out. These are the qualities that I've got to weed out of my mind, my heart, my life, so that I can make room for these other qualities, so that I can live a good life, not just to please God, obviously a good motivation to please God, but we can discover exactly how we can do ourselves good, because these qualities of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control are all things that actually are good for our mental health as well. Now we're going through this period of lockdown, aren't we? The nation is having to restrict its activities in very serious ways in order to counteract this dreadful pandemic. Now, when I started off this, I didn't really have a lot of thought about talking about the pandemic as such. But here we are. It seems to be a relevant point, really. In this time of restriction of the national life and personal life as well, people are talking about good mental health, aren't they? And they're saying, well, there are things that we can do to promote our mental health. Off the top of my head, I can't remember any of them. You can see how closely I've been paying attention to television broadcasts about mental health. But I've got my own list here, and it seems to me that these qualities practiced assiduously and displacing the qualities, what I called the acts of the sinful nature, are just the way to go for good mental health, for promoting psychological balance. These are the things to do: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Because these are not just kind of soft and woolly emotions, aren't they? When I say, well, love, for instance, lots of people have different ideas about love, and many will just think, well, yeah, I love my girlfriend, I love my mum, I love my wife, etc., etc. And these are good manifestations of love. But when you think about in the wider context, you're talking about something which is turning into a control on your own personal behavior, and something that happens in here which is not above and beyond, but something else other than just familial love or love of your wife. This is a different kind of love. And the phrase, that the description of the quality at the end of this list, I think, is really very significant. We've got self-control. Now, how often do we hear about self-control in this day and age? Well, I don't know. I mean, it seems like self-indulgence is the thing that we're hearing most about, isn't it? What do these adverts say? You deserve something or other. You deserve a holiday. You deserve some kind of food. You deserve a new electronic device. You deserve this. Well, I don't know. What is it we deserve? Is that the right way to go about it? If we practice self-control, we don't think that we deserve anything, because that leads to all kinds of other negative emotions, perhaps like frustration or self-pity. And this is not good. This is not leading to good mental health, is it? So self-control is probably the key to the rest of the list. Although it's tacked on the end, it's the key. If we practice self-control, then we're not going to have fits of rage, are we? If we have self-control, we're going to rein back our selfish ambition. And goodness knows we're all capable of that kind of thing. Maybe we just think of ourselves and nobody else. Like the pandemic, we ourselves personally are self-isolating. This is because of existing health problems and age factors, but also it's about protecting other people as well. And that is the rather more sort of selfless and outgoing thought and motivation that makes us self-isolate, not just to preserve ourselves, but to preserve other people's health and possibly even lives as well. So self-control is probably the key to this list, a very important thing. And it's heartening to know that Paul reckons against such things there is no law whatsoever. We're free to practice these things, and it's a good choice to make. Not because it's especially spiritual, but because it's good for us. It's good for the mental health. I'd recommend it, really, and what more can I say but see if you can promote that kind of change in your own life and reap the benefits. See what change, that kind of change, based on the fruits of the Spirit, can make in your own life. So that's my recommendation for this time. Stay safe and keep well.